It started.
Okay, so this is where we were last time. We were looking at if we're in a recession, all right, so aggregate demand shift to the left, we're getting deflation, price levels have fallen, output is falling, unemployment is rising. How do we address it? Once again, if we're classical economists, we don't take policy action, we do
Nothing.
nothing, because the economy will self-regulate and fix itself. Right? The classical economists are going to be supply-siders. What they expect to shift is going to be SRAS to shift to the right eventually, and rise wages and prices become flexible, and we will be back at a long-run equilibrium output. And Gabe is desperately trying to figure out how to lower the shades.
These things are ridiculous. Because the glare is too intense for the camera. How do you do? There's like 18 chords for one.
You gotta pull it back. There's always a little
Yeah, the
back.
little lock thing.
Okay, stop.
Russian roulette with the flag.
Why would it be that way? It's always this way. There we go.
That's not how it works here.
Yeah, just trying to. Okay, now we can actually see the board.
All right. So we got this set up here, right? And so we're in a recession. Classical economists say we do nothing if we get a Keynesian type, we take action, either fiscal policy or monetary policy. With fiscal policy, right, in both cases, we're going to do expansionary policy, right? Which is going to be where it's a matter of spending. So if aggregate demand is equal to consumption plus business investment plus government spending plus net exports, right, that investment and consumption has gone down, which means aggregate demand shifted left, right? They look at it as being a problem of people are not spending enough, we need people to spend more, right? So we're going to expand spending through expansionary fiscal policy. Government spends more money, which means people have more money to be able to blow on stuff, which will increase GDP, will increase spending and investment. Right, or we can lower taxes. Lower taxes mean that people keep more of their money, which means they have more money to spend. You'll see the consumption and investment go up, and we'll shift to the right. Okay. With the Fed, they're going to manipulate interest rates by manipulating the money supply. Okay. Because if interest rates are lower, what do people want to do?
Spend more.
Spend more, right? They're less likely to save because they won't get as much by savings. All right, and not only that, but it's easier to take out loans. So lower interest rates means more spending, right? So when they enlarge the money supply, so this is our money market graph, right? Money supply shifts to the right. When it shifts to the right, interest rates fall. When interest rates fall, people spend more, so consumption goes up. Businesses will also be more likely to invest in capital and less likely to save their money, so investment will go up. And then aggregate demand will increase. It will shift back to where it originally was. All right, so we got the idea here. However, things can go a little bit wrong. Sometimes when you have a really good economy, what can happen instead? Inflation will occur. Okay, so we're gonna change our graph here so we can see the inflation happening. RGDP, what's the y-axis? What's the y-axis?
Price level.
Price level, PL. Come on, you guys gotta know all these things. This line is?
Aggregate demand.
Yes. This line?
Aggregate. Oh, wait, no, it's short one.
Yeah, SRAS, short run aggregate supply. Vertical one is?
Long run.
Long run aggregate supply. It intersects at Y sub F, full employment output. Okay, so the economy is going really well, which can occur, right? We got our C plus IG plus G plus XN again. The economy is going well, incomes tend to rise. And when people have more money, what do they do with the more money?
Spend.
Yeah, they spend it. So that means aggregate demand will shift to the right. Okay. And when that occurs, price levels rise. And we call that inflation. Okay. Price level rise, output rises also. Right now we can be here temporarily anyway. right? But we're past full employment output. If we're a classical economist, what do?
Nothing.
Nothing. Again, the economy will self-regulate itself. What do we expect to shift if we take no policy action? We're going to be classical. Supply again, right? So just like another scenario, we're going to expect SRAS to shift, except this time it'll shift leftwards. Okay? Get back to long-run equilibrium. And the reason behind this is kind of the opposite of what we had before. Before in that scenario, we said, well, when we're in a recession, unemployment gets bad enough, wages and prices will start to become flexible as contracts expire, etc., and employers start to pay their workers less, and they're able to make more profit. Okay. Here, what's happening though is going to be inflation. All right. If I'm the employer, how's this working out for me? The inflation, in the short run, anyway.
You're paying.
It's coming out well, all right? I'm making bank. I'm selling my products for higher prices than I did before. And remember, the wages and prices are sticky in the short run, so I'm paying my workers the same number of dollars as I was before. But what's happening to the value of those dollars?
They've gone down.
Yeah, they're getting cheaper, right? I pay my workers less valuable dollars. So I paid them $10 an hour before the inflation. I'm still paying them $10 an hour now, but the $10 isn't worth as much. Effectively, I'm paying them less, okay? Nominal wages stayed the same, real wages went down, okay? So this is a good development for me, but can I keep this up for long? Can I keep stiffing my workers like this? No, right? They're experiencing inflation. They're paying higher prices for stuff. What do they want?
More money.
More money. I'm gonna have to give it to them because we're past full employment, right? The unemployment rate is really low. What am I having trouble finding? Workers, right? So I'm having trouble finding new workers. If I want to find new workers, what do I have to do? Well,
Higher
I gotta
wage.
pay more money, or I gotta raise wages, nominal wages. If I want to keep my current workers from leaving me for somebody else, I have to raise wages, right? My labor unions, they're going to go on strike. Contracts expire. My suppliers, they want more money for their resources than what they did before. So as wages and prices become flexible, right? I make less money, I'm making less profit as the employer, so therefore I don't want to make as much, and SRAS will shift to the left, get back to long-run equilibrium. Again, that's the classical economist. If I'm going to be a policy type, a Keynesian type, what do I want to do?
Shift the demand.
Yeah, I'm going to shift aggregate demand. Because here, again, it's perceived as a spending problem. Right now, people are spending too much. Right? All that money they've got out there, they're blowing it all. And the reason we're seeing inflation is because there's too much money chasing too few goods. Right? People are trying to spend, but we can't produce enough stuff for people to be able to buy, right, in the short run. Okay, so this is why we're experiencing inflation. Demand is increasing, supply is not. So prices are going up. Okay, so people are spending too much. We need people to spend less. All right. So this is where we can do contractionary policy. Okay, we can do contractionary fiscal, we can do contractionary monetary. Okay, contractionary fiscal policy, instead of more government spending, we'll do less government spending. You don't need all that out there. Instead of lowering taxes, we will raise taxes, right? Both cases, that will limit the level of spending that people will be able to do within the economy. All right? And then over here, when it comes to a monetary policy, the Fed can come along and do contractionary monetary policy, which means lowering the money supply. When they do that, okay, they'll raise the discount rate, make it more difficult for banks to borrow from the Fed, which means that fewer excess reserves will build up at the bank, and therefore there won't be as much money loaned out and more money being created. They can raise the required reserve ratio, because when that ratio is higher, banks have to keep more money and they cannot loan out as much money. When banks can't loan out as much, they can't create as much. Not only that, but the multiplier will be smaller as well. Because the money multiplier is 1 over the required reserve ratio, right? So if the ratio was 10%, that would make the money multiplier 10. Now, let's say the ratio was 20%, all right, that would make the money multiplier just 5, okay? And then the third thing that they can do is sell bonds on the bond market. Okay, so they'll go out there, they'll sell the bonds they have, sold them to banks. Banks give the Fed money in return for those bonds. What does the Fed do with that money? Poof, ceases to exist, right? Again, it's not too much more complicated than they just take some numbers out of the bank accounts they have with the Fed, and that money is now no longer out there in circulation. Okay? Reserves in banks are drawn down when this happens because banks paid for the bonds with excess reserves that they had. And when this happens, what we see is a reverse of this stuff. So money supply shifts to the left because we have decreased the money supply. And then interest rates rise. When interest rates rise, what do people do?
Spend less.
Spend less. More likely to save their money instead of spending it because they will get more by saving it than what they did previously. So more likely to save instead of spend, and they will be less likely to borrow money, and therefore they will spend less. Okay? So consumption will go down, business investment will go down, aggregate demand will go down, and we get shifted back to where it originally was. Okay? Now, ideally, we don't get to this point at all, right? If they're exercising policy in a good, responsible, timely manner, you keep aggregate demand from shifting out there, right? So you do contractionary policy to slow the economy down, right? Not necessarily reverse it, right? Which would be the case here, right? But you slow it down, right? Which sounds weird that you wanted the economy to slow down, possibly. But the idea behind it is that if you start seeing inflationary pressures where people are spending, is that the economy will grow too fast, right? Spending will increase more than what supply can keep up, and the economy overheats until eventually you get a nasty crash. Okay? So by slowing it down, you're actually slowing it down to a manageable level where production and everything else can keep up with the level of spending. Okay? So this is the idea behind all of this with the policy action, both expansionary and contractionary. It's about trying to affect levels of spending within the economy, pick it up when the spending level is going to be too low, all right, when you're in a recession, and trying to decrease it when you're experiencing inflation and people are spending too much. Okay? Questions on this stuff? Nothing? Okay. Now, let's review a couple of issues here when it comes to policy action. And one of those issues was time lag or policy lag. And what was the problem here?
There's another problem before you get to the first one.
Okay, yeah, we
First
know
one
that.
resolves itself before the action is actually put out.
Okay. The idea with time lag and policy lag is that by the time action is actually taken to address the issue, either fiscal policy or monetary policy, time has passed between when the problem began and when you take action on it, okay? Or seeing what the effects are. So if your timing is wrong, you can actually make things worse, right? So on, right, if you get yourself a business cycle graph, right, business cycle, remember, is measuring our GDP over time. So business cycle goes like this over time, right? Goes up, goes down, right? Where GDP is increasing, decreasing, right? But over time, you want the trend line to be going upwards if you're to average it all out, right? So ideally, what you do with policy action is you even out the ups and the downs, right? You try to make them farther out, and you want expansions to last longer, right? You want to make it more flat, okay? So ideally, policy action would make the business cycle look more like this, right? But if your timing is off, what can happen instead?
It can probably go down.
Woo! All right, you can actually make the curves more extreme than what they were before, okay? In fact, if you're a classical economist who say, don't mess with it, their argument is that policy action actually does the red line, and it's actually making it worse, right? We'd be better, they say, if we just left it alone instead of trying to manipulate it. Right. So if you remember, if you recall the Keynes and Hayek thing, right? That whole rap and the explanation is they argue that when you have government and the Federal Reserve coming along and just doing this willy-nilly fiscal policy and monetary policy, you're actually making things worse, right? Interest rates are signals to the market and signals to the people, right? They're signals to spend or signals to save, right? And so if you're coming along and making interest rates artificially low, that tells people to spend, not to save, right?
Right.
But is that really saved money that's out there? No, that's just the Fed tossing more money into the system and artificially keeping them low. And so then people will invest their money or save their money, put their money in places where maybe it's not best put, right? What do they call it? Malallocation? That's not right. But investing in things that are not best invested in. Yeah. So this is where you can create financial bubbles. So they argue like during the 2008-2009 financial crisis, part of the problem there was interest rates being manipulated in such a way that it caused people to put their money in what seemed to be like safer investments at the time, which was
Wrong.
it was houses and it was mortgage-backed securities, which had traditionally been very safe, but the interest rates were better at the time, so it got diversified in such a way that it was actually rather dangerous, right, as far as where money was going. So misallocation of investments, and the end result being you got a financial bubble where the value of houses was a lot better, the price on houses was much more than what the normal value would be, and eventually what happened? Yeah, it crashed, right? The bubble popped, and a whole bunch of people lose their money. Yeah. So they argue that you're actually creating financial bubbles and creating these artificial highs, and you're exacerbating what the lows are going to be by taking these actions. Anyway, but the idea with time lag, right, which can be a problem here, and this exists especially with fiscal policy. It's going to be a problem with monetary policy also, but it's more of a problem with fiscal, right? This is the idea that the problem begins over here, right? But do we address the problem immediately?
No.
Right, the economic problem begins over here, but before we can do anything about it, right, we got to realize there is a problem, which means time passes. Then we got to figure out what the problem is, and more time passes, right? We talk to the economists and policymakers, and then we got to figure out what we're going to do about it. That's more time passing because now we've got Congress involved in a whole bunch of politics. So the problem begins over here, and finally Congress will take action all the way over here. Okay. So we could be talking about months between the problem beginning and actually doing something about it, right? If we're going to do expansionary or contractionary. So we're addressing a problem potentially as it existed several months ago, right? And we're doing something now. So we might be doing too much. We might be doing too little, all right? We could potentially be doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. So we could be making things worse. So this is a problem with lag, okay? Now, we've got the two, right? Remember, there's inside lag and outside lag. Inside lag is the time from when the problem begins to actually taking action, okay? And then you have outside lag, which is the time from taking action to seeing what the results are, okay? So we have inside lag, outside lag. Now, this is more of a problem for fiscal than what it is for monetary, because with fiscal, you have lots of people who are in the kitchen, right? Lots of cooks. So we're talking about Congress again, so you got 535 people there, you got a president, so that's another person added into the mix. All right, a whole lot of people are going to be involved in this, whereas when we're talking about monetary policy, how many people decide on the monetary policy? Yeah, right, you've got 19 people on the FOMC and 12 of them vote. All right, so you ultimately have 12 people who make the decisions, and they can start exercising monetary policy the next day. Right, so they don't even have to worry about trying to get money out the door like the government does, all right, or having longer term effects of seeing what changes in tax rates are going to be. Okay, the Fed is able to take action rather immediately. Okay, it's still a problem for them, don't get me wrong, it's just not as much of a problem for monetary policy in the Fed as what it is for fiscal policy and the government. Okay, so time lag is an issue with that.
So by the time they take action, it should naturally fix itself, or would that be a longer period?
I'm sorry, say it again?
So So by the time they do fix something, it should theoretically naturally fix itself.
Well, no, not necessarily, right? You can wind up having you can wind up having a long-standing issue, right, or it can take a while, right? Even the classical economists aren't necessarily going to say that things are going to fix itself quickly, right? You could wind up having a couple of years there, but you know, you'll be better off on the other side, right, if you let it go. It's kind of funny, if you look at like the Great Depression, right, all economists will look at the Great Depression and try to figure out, well, what should we have done? Did we do the right thing or not? And depending on your theory, you'll interpret the Great Depression in a completely different way. If you're a Keynesian type, you'll say, oh no, we did what we should have done. In fact, you know what? It lasted as long as it did because...
The New Deal.
We did something.
Oh, 'cause-
Well, no, it lasted as long as it did. It lasted, you know, like 10 years or whatever, but it lasted that long because we didn't do enough. We should have done more. Right.
Oh, Keynesian. Oh, yeah, that's right.
So, and then if you're going to be more of a classical economist, they look at the same stuff and the same data and argue, well, no, one of the reasons it lasts as long as it is because we tried doing too much, right? We would have been significantly better off had we done less, right, than what we did. Even Hoover gets a bad rap as being a do-nothing guy, right? Isn't that the reputation he has?
Yes.
Is, oh, FDR came in and he did all this stuff, a New Deal and whatnot, and Hoover was Nero, right? Fiddling while Rome burned. Well, no, actually, Hoover was extremely activist as a president. And, huh?
Mr. Hooverville or whatever it was.
Well, he doubled, what was that? It was the federal budget doubled during his presidency, right? And even later on, many of the New Dealers admitted, several of them admitted that many of the things they came up with were just extensions of what Hoover started. Right? In fact, there was a little bit of an irony is that in the 1932 presidential election, FDR campaigned against Hoover in part by saying that Hoover was doing too much.
That's
Yeah.
insane.
And then FDR came in and said, hold my beer, right? And went way farther. Okay? And even calling it the New Deal, right? The New Deal makes it sound like it was this coordinated program, right? Like this was planned out, it was all coordinated, it was all planned. No, it wasn't. They were throwing things against the wall and just trying to see if anything worked or not. And if it didn't work, they kept doing it. Right? FDR at one point when I was fireside chat said, what we need is bold experimentation, right? This is what we need right now to try and experiment, which sounds great until you realize that you're the one being experimented upon, all right? And you're hoping the policymakers succeed in their experiments with their hypotheses and are wrong, right? Which is a little bit of a risk. Yeah, it wasn't coordinated at all. It was just a random set of stuff they came up with, kind of an ad hoc basis. Even one of my favorite things is, so we went off the gold standard, right? But before that, the government was deciding what the price of gold would be in terms of dollars, right? And every day they would decide on if they were going to make any changes to it. And FDR decided on his own, pretty much. And it was completely arbitrary. Like at one point he said that, well, it's going to be, I can't remember the exact figures, but it was going to be something like, it was going to be $7 per ounce or something like that. That's because, no, it's $21 per ounce. That's what he decided it was going to be, right? And the reason he decided that is that 7 is a lucky number and 21 is 3 times 7. No,
Did he actually?
yes,
Oh my god.
right?
The original.
And later on, this advisor who said this is how things were being said, he was like, people would have been shocked at the time had they realized that this is how we're deciding on some of these policies, is just the completely arbitrary unilateral method, right?
He just picked it like based on his birthday or something.
Yeah, pretty much, right?
The
You know,
original
people
horoscope
think,
world,
oh, well, it's all
astrology world.
coordinated. There was, science and backing behind it and economic theory. And it's like, no, this was just, FDR woke up and had some coffee and
Eeny, miny, mowed it.
feeling $21 today, right? Lucky numbers, right? And that's what they went with. Okay, so, so if you look at something like the Great Depression, right, you wind up coming up with very different interpretations depending upon your theoretical approach to it, right? Certainly we're still dealing with it and everything's got to be a New Deal, right? So the Green New Deal was not the latest thing to use the term New Deal, right? You've had all sorts of other proposals in the past for, broad-reaching stuff that was called something New Deal, right? Even the New Deal wasn't an original name. FDR got that from where? Anybody know?
No.
Hoover?
No, it wasn't Hoover actually, but yeah. No, it's from Theodore Roosevelt, FDR's cousin, right? Because Theodore Roosevelt had a program that he recalled the Square Deal. All right, so he was trying to grab some of that, Theodore Rooseveltian thunder and call his thing the New Deal. So the Square Deal.
FDR is just a poser.
Well, he definitely did have a little bit of inferiority complex towards
Other
Theodore.
presidents.
But hey, who doesn't have an inferiority complex towards Theodore Roosevelt?
I wish I was him.
A man who would occasionally swim naked across the Potomac River as exercise.
What?
What else? He did jujitsu.
Ladies, if you're
In the White
listening, I'm
House.
sorry I can't be
And
him.
he only took up jujitsu, by the way, because previously to that he was doing boxing in the White House, and he detached his retina while he was sparring with somebody, and never told anybody. So he took
Alpha.
up jujitsu because he considered that to be safer than continuing to do boxing. Right? At the same time, this is a guy who also would read 1 or 2 books per day. He was a voracious reader. Also published a number of books himself on various topics.
He was really
Published a
smart.
number of nature articles also. When he was not president anymore, what's one of the first things he did?
Didn't he go on like a
Yeah, he went off on a
travel?
safari,
Yeah.
right? And later, him and one of his sons did an Amazonian expedition where they were mapping a tributary to the Amazon River. And during the process, Roosevelt got really sick and his leg got infected from an injury. And unbeknownst to people, but whenever Roosevelt went on these expeditions of his, he would take a cyanide capsule so he could off himself and not be a burden to the rest of the expedition crew.
Oh.
And so he was gonna take it, but his son wouldn't allow him to do it. He told his dad that I'm taking you out of here alive or dead, and it's easier if you're alive, so don't take it. Right? So yeah.
Pretty cool guy.
Hardcore.
And then you know the story about how he got shot before his speech, right?
And then continued the speech and
Yes.
finished it.
Right. He was on his way to give a speech. An assassin tries shooting him. The bullet goes through his glasses case, as well as his folded up speech, which itself was rather thick, but it still went into his chest. And he went and gave like an hour-long speech anyway. In fact, he used it as a prop. When he started the speech, he was like, open his jacket so that everybody could see his blood-stained shirt, right? Which is soaked with blood by this point. It's like, so just got shot, but
We're gonna continue anyway.
yeah,
The show
you
must
can't
go
stop a
on.
bull moose, right? So he gave his speech, and then he went to the hospital. And he left the bullet in, by the way. He didn't take it out.
Oh,
He let it heal over.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well,
Well-
yeah, sometimes it's easier to just leave it in, 'cause if they take it out, you could die of blood loss.
He was still alive, and he didn't have a second chest wound, right? His lung hadn't collapsed. And he's also cognizant of what happened to McKinley, the president that he replaced, right? McKinley died from an assassination after he got hit by a bullet. And some people speculate that one of the things that killed McKinley was not so much the bullet itself as
dirty tools.
the efforts to get the bullet out, right? There's actually an existing X-ray of Theodore Roosevelt's bullet where you can actually see it in his chest. But X-rays were rather new at the time. Before this, if you wanted to find where the bullet was, what'd you do?
You just look.
Feel.
Poked your finger in there, right? And dug around till you felt that thing, right? And then you'd have to, get some pliers and dig it out. And then you had to worry about the fabric and stuff that might be in there with the bullet. And by the time you did all that stuff, you could do almost more damage than what the original bullet did, or introduce more potential for infection. And yeah, so Roosevelt's experience with such wounds told him that, let's just leave that guy there. Yeah, it worked. Anyway, okay, that was a significant rabbit trail. Okay.
Aw, keep going.
Other stuff. Okay. So we've got these issues over here, right? So talking about what's going to happen with expansion rate policy and monetary policy and all this stuff. All right, let's talk a little bit about Phillips curve, right? Because I think some people are a little bit unclear on that. Yes, Phillips curve. Yeah. Okay, so it's a graph just like all the other graphs, and what's on the x-axis? You remember what's on the x-axis of Phillips curve? Unemployment, All right, unemployment rate. Okay, so you should really express it as U%. All right, if you just put U, that indicates unemployment, which is the concept of unemployment, but this is unemployment rate, so unemployment percentage. And then on the y-axis, that is inflation rate, all right, which we'll express as pi%. All right, and then you have this downward sloping curve, which is the short-run Phillips curve, and then you have a vertical line, which is the long-run Phillips curve, which intersects at the natural rate of unemployment. Okay. And what we see here with the short-run Phillips curve is because it's downward sloping, what we have is an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. Okay. They go in opposite directions. When the inflation rate tends to be high, the unemployment rate tends to be low. When the inflation rate tends to be low, the unemployment rate tends to be high. Or at least this is what the historical data had indicated in the 50s and 60s. Again, it hasn't really worked this way in about the past 40 years, but we refuse to give it up. All right. The Fed has given it up for the most part, but College Board again has not. Okay. So we see this inverse relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. But in the long run, what's the relationship? There isn't one. Okay, in the long run, there is no relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. Okay, in the long run, it doesn't matter what's happening to inflation, we're going to be at the natural rate of unemployment, right? Whatever it is that it happens to be for that country, right? It could be 3%, 4%, 5%, 6%, whatever. Okay, but you have that natural rate that the economy will gravitate to. Now, we see some correspondence between this graph and this graph over here, right? The idea of the long-run aggregate supply curve is the neutrality of money, right? That in the long run, price levels, inflation, value of the money won't have an effect on where we'll be at full employment output because the economy will adjust to whatever is happening to the value of the money in the long run. Okay, again, double the money in circulation, we would ultimately get double prices, double wages, right? Be back to where we are. Same sort of idea over here. Right, you can increase inflation and it'll have effects in the short run, but the economy will adjust to the inflation rate and the new value of the money, and we'll get back to the same place again. Okay, so it doesn't matter in the long run. It matters in the short run, but it doesn't matter in the long run. Right, not a relationship between the two. Okay, but because of this, we can also see correspondence here between the graph. Right, so if we were to say this is point A where we began over here. Right, when the economy is in long-run equilibrium, this will correspond to being in point A right there, long-run equilibrium. Okay, so at this particular inflation rate, that natural rate of unemployment, whatever it is, let's say it's 5%, right, we're going to be on long run. Now, when we had inflation, right, and this is where we can use our graphs together. If we look over here, when aggregate demand shifted to the right, what happened to the inflation rate? What happened to price levels? Yeah, price levels increase, which we also call that inflation. Right? So the inflation rate increased. And when it shifted to the right, we had more output. We're making more stuff. If we make more stuff, what does that mean happens to the unemployment rate? It goes down. If we're making more stuff, we need more workers. Unemployment goes down. So we're going this way on the y-axis, and we're going this way on the x-axis. So if this is our point right here, what does that mean is happening? Inflation is more inflation, less unemployment. So the point is going like this. Okay? Because they're going in opposite directions, right? One is going up and the other is going down, which is what this represents as SRPC, going in opposite directions. So we know that we're moving along the line, the
Why
SRPC.
doesn't the Phillips curve like apply anymore?
So the historical data, again, this is when they looked at the 50s and 60s especially, data from there. And what they saw is that if you plotted out the points, right, for given months and years, you saw a relationship here between the two, right? that when the inflation rate was high, unemployment was low, et cetera, right? So that if you drew a trend line, right, averaging all those plot points, you have this downward sloping line, right? You saw a definite correspondence in that cloud. But since then, starting in roughly the 70s, but then forward, the plot points are all over the place, right? We're going to see periods of high inflation and high unemployment and low inflation and low unemployment, right? Basically, their exercise of fiscal and monetary policy since then is such that it's disrupted the connection here, right? Where you don't see such a definitive connection between the two. So this is why it's still a little bit in debate, right? So a lot of people tend to feel like the Federal Reserve have given up on the Phillips curve. They don't consider it to be relevant anymore. Because again, the data over the past 30 years has not shown there to be a connection between the two, right? Used to be, yes, but the way we're doing things now, no. You still have some economists, though, and other people within the Fed who say, no, we need to keep this around. It's still a useful tool, right? Or it can still come back to bite us in ways we don't realize, right? So, I don't want to say that the Fed has definitively given up on the Phillips curve, but many people within the Fed have, right? There are still some holdouts, though. But it's because the data is not as firm as what it used to be, all right? Answer your question? Yeah. Okay. So point B will correspond with this one over here, right? Price levels went up, more inflation, output increase, which means less unemployment. They go in opposite directions, so we moved along the line, okay? So remember this, if you ever shift aggregate demand over here, shifting aggregate demand means you move along the line on the SRPC. And notice we went in the opposite direction. Aggregate demand shifted right, where'd the point go? Left. Okay, so you can think of it that way, but also remember the data over here, right, the movement, we see price increases, we see lower unemployment, we can figure that out, right, see what's happening over there. Now, sometimes on these questions, they don't necessarily say, well, if aggregate demand shifts right, what'll happen to ESR, on a Phillips curve graph, or draw a correctly labeled Phillips curve graph and show what happens if aggregate demand shifts right. Lots of times they'll give you some other causative element, right? So they'll be like, okay, the Fed buys bonds, what's happening on the Phillips curve graph, or something like that, all right? Or based upon your answer in B, where you said the Fed buys bonds, draw a correctly labeled Phillips curve graph and show what happens. Okay, so it'll be something like that. They're expecting you to make the connections. All right, so there you have to make the connections between buying bonds. Buying bonds increases the money supply, which lowers interest rates, which means more spending. Aggregate demand shifts right, which means more inflation, less unemployment. You'd be moving upwards to the left on the SRPC. Okay. Again, they're trying to make you to make connections and figure out this chain of causes and events. Right, if I turn the dial over here, right, what's happening behind the machine so you can figure out what's going to happen to the gauge over here, okay? Now, let's say we don't do anything. We're going to be classical economists. So what's going to shift? Yeah, SRAS will shift to the left, get back at long-run equilibrium again. Now what happened here is the price levels went up more. So we have, what happened to inflation? Inflation went up. Now output fell, we're producing less stuff, so what happened to the unemployment rate? Huh? It went up. So in this case, inflation went up and unemployment went up. Can we move along this line and get more of both? No, we can't. What's the only way we can get more of both? If the SRPC shifts. In this case, it shifted right. Okay. So our point C over here, back at long run will correspond with C over here. Okay. So in comparison to point B, more inflation, more unemployment. Okay, the two graphs work together. Now, easy way to remember this also, again, you can look at what's happening to price levels and output to figure out what's happening to the inflation rate and unemployment rate. You can also think to yourself, When SRAS shifts to the left, what does SRPC do? Shifts right, right? They shift in opposite directions. SRAS shifts to the left, SRPC shifts right. Which means that if SRAS were to shift right, what's going to happen to SRPC?
What?
It's going to shift to the left. Okay? So SRAS and SRPC shift in opposite directions, right? One goes left, other goes right, vice versa. All right? Questions on this?
No.
All right. Let's talk about one more thing. We'll talk about loadable funds. And we'll stop there. So this is already, how much time has already gone by? Gabe?
40 minutes, 54 seconds and counting.
Yeah.
Go ahead and stop.
No, keep going.
Okay.
But I'll stop after this next thing. What was the question? Somebody said something with me? All right, this is the loadable funds graph. Supply and demand of loadable funds. Okay, loadable funds, again, are what they sound like. These are funds within the banking system that are there to be loaned out. Okay, so the x-axis is the quantity of loanable funds, the amount of loanable funds in the banking system to be loaned out. The lowercase r, what does that stand for? Huh? Yes, real interest rate. Okay, remember, real interest rate is when we have adjusted for inflation. Okay, if you don't remember this, real is equal to nominal minus inflation. Okay, real is equal to nominal minus inflation. It's going to be this way with interest rates. It'll work this way with wages and other things. Okay. So if the nominal rate, right, let's say you take out a loan at 7%, and there's 3% inflation, what is the real interest rate you're paying? 4%. Okay, the number of dollars you're paying back on that loan is 7%. So say you take out a $1,000 loan and you're gonna have 7% interest for 1 year, you're gonna pay back, $1,070. Okay, 7%. But in terms of real value, you're only paying back 4%. Because that $1,070 you paid back in the previous year would have had value of only $1,040, which is that 4%. That's the same sort of buying power. Okay? But it'll work this way with wages and everything else. As a side note to this, this also means that banks will always set their interest rates, their nominal rates above what?
The interest.
They'll always set their nominal interest
Oh,
rates
above
above
inflation.
what the expected rate of inflation is. Okay? So if they want a 4% return on their loans and they're expecting 3%, they're going to set their nominal rates at 7%. Let's say expectations change and they expect now that the inflation rate will be 5%. But they still want a 4% real return. So what will they set their nominal rate at now? 9%. Okay? They'll set their nominal rate above what the expected rate is to keep getting the real return they want. Okay? But what if the bank is completely wrong? Let's say we go back here, they set it at 7%, but inflation was a lot higher than what they expected, and it winds up being a 9% inflation. What happens now?
-2%.
-2%. Right? Real return, which means what's happening to the bank?
Losing money.
They're losing money, right? They're still getting paid back 7% as far as number of dollars go, but that money is going to be less, 2% less, worth 2% less than what they initially loaned out, right? Basically, they paid somebody else to borrow money from them, okay? So it sucks for them, but who's good for it?
The person.
Yeah, the borrower. It's good for the borrower, right? Because they paid back -2%. All right, unexpected inflation, bad for lenders, good for borrowers. All right, anyway, so real interest rate, so this is the demand for loanable funds, all right? Who's demanding loanable funds? Customers, borrowers, right? Borrowers are the ones who demand those loanable funds. They're the ones who want to buy loanable funds at an interest rate. Okay, borrowers. Think of demand for loanable funds as being roughly equivalent to borrowing. Okay, and who is supplying loanable funds? Who's supplying the money to be loaned out in the banking system?
The
The
Fed?
government?
Us?
Us, right?
Us.
Savers. You
Yeah.
save your money, you put it into a bank. When you put your money into the bank, what happens to that money?
They loan it.
They can loan it out, right? You're supplying the loanable funds in the banking system to save money. So for the most part, the supply of loanable funds is savings. Okay, now the Fed can also affect the supply of loanable funds when they do monetary policy, right? Because if they expand the money supply, where's that money gonna wind up? As supply of loanable funds in the banking system. Okay. So what we see here, though, right? We got the supply and the demand, right? And so shifts in these can wind up affecting interest rates. Okay, and this is where we have that crowding out effect. Remember that? Okay, crowding out effect. So this was that unintended consequence of government expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, because if the government is doing expansionary fiscal policy, it's going to spend more money at the same time as it will bring in less money. Okay, so spending will increase while tax revenue that it uses to pay for its spending is going to go down. Okay, so just like you, if you're going to spend more money than what you have coming in, we're going to get the difference. If you have $1,000 a week coming in, but you're spending $1,200 a week, how are you getting that extra $200 you're spending every week?
Can you say?
It could be from savings, but there's also a decent chance it's loans. You're borrowing money, right? You're going into debt in order to be able to do that. So this is what the government is doing, right? It's going to increase spending while less money is coming in, so it's going to borrow the difference. Well, over here, which one of these was borrowing, demand, or supply? Demand is. So the government borrowing more money increases the demand for loanable funds. See how this works out, right? Increase the demand for loanable funds within the system, and when they do that, what happens to interest rates? Yeah, they increase. Okay, because this is really just a supply and demand graph, right? This is the quantity, this is the price of the product, right? So if there's more demand for the product, price is going to rise. Because the banks are going to look at it and be like, oh, people are trying to borrow more money. What can I do to the prices of my loans if people are trying to borrow more than what they were before? Jack up the interest rates. Interest rates rise. Why is this a problem if we're trying to do expansionary policy?
Because then
It makes people
less
want to spend
willing.
Okay, yeah. With expansionary policy, fiscal policy, we're trying to get people to spend more. Okay, we're trying to get people to spend more with expansionary policy. But if interest rates are rising, what are people going to do instead? Spend less, right? At higher interest rates, they're more likely to save their money instead of spending it, right? And less likely to take out loans. So the government's expansionary fiscal policy can have an unintended consequence, a side effect, of actually decreasing spending instead of increasing spending, okay, by inadvertently raising interest rates. And that's what we call the crowding out effect. Because the government is crowding out private investment by raising interest rates through its increased borrowing and its increased spending, okay? So we get the opposite of what we want, okay? So what can the Fed do to counteract this? Expansionary monetary policy, because what happens in expansionary monetary policy?
They decrease.
Drives interest rates down. Okay. Now we have the opposite, which is also called the crowding in effect, but you won't see that one as often. Crowding in effect is just the opposite, right? So the economy is inflating, the government wants people to spend less. So the government lowers spending, increases taxes, but then that means the government is not borrowing as much money. So what will happen to the demand for loanable funds? Yeah, it'll shift to the left, which will lower interest rates to get people to spend more. at the same time as the government is trying to get people to spend less. Okay, and that's crowding in effect. Again, that's not as common on tests as crowding out effect. Don't talk about that one as much. Okay, questions on any of this stuff?
Mm.
Okay, you guys not